Hello, and welcome to the super fast 5-minute digital literature review and presentation on Virginia Woolf's novel, To the Lighthouse. This comprehensive and succinct project will examine basic facts about and themes within the story, will provide character outlines and analyses, and provide a short summary of this incredible story.
General information.
To the Lighthouse was published in 1927 through the Hogarth Press. It was written in a stream of consciousness format, which basically means that the characters express their thoughts with no certain structure to guide them. This allows the reader to really look into the characters' minds. The novel takes place by the sea on the Isle of Skye, which is by Scotland. Themes vary, including differences between man and woman, contemplating a meaning of life, the roles of females in society, and the profits of being a revolutionary artist.
Characters.
To the Lighthouse is about many characters who lodge together and interact on a daily basis. The figurehead of the story is the good housewife, Mrs. Ramsay, who has a very beautiful, kind, and friendly demeanor. She lives with her husband, Mr. Ramsay. Mr. Ramsay, unlike Mrs. Ramsay, is constantly isolated. His job as a philosopher always shadows his thinking. There are 8 Ramsay children. James and Cam, the youngest boy and girl, are the most emphasized in the story. Charles Tansley, Mr. Ramsay's young philosopher friend, also lodges with the Ramsays. He is commonly described to be unpleasant and rude. Paul Rayleigh comes to visit the Ramsays. He is urged by Mrs. Ramsay to marry a woman named Minta Doyle. Lily Briscoe is a young painter who comes to visit as well. She's constantly trying to paint a masterpiece with little success throughout the story. She contemplates marrying the old botanist William Banks, one of Mr. Ramsay's few friends. She never does. Mrs. McNabb is the housekeeper for the Ramsay household when the Ramsays move out. McAllister is a fisherman. He helps Mr. Ramsay, James, and Cam reach the lighthouse toward the end of the story. McAllister's son is so insignificant that he doesn't even get a name. Last but not least, there's Augustus Carmichael, who's addicted to opium but eventually becomes popular for his poetry.
Summary 1.
The beginning of the story begins with young James asking his mother if they can go to the lighthouse across the sea. Mrs. Ramsay, ever the optimist, brightly encourages this, but the gloomy Mr. Ramsay breaks in, crushing James's hopes by saying that going to the lighthouse won't be possible. James, devastated by the comments, reveals that he secretly hates his father. Later, Mrs. Ramsay and Charles Tansley head to town together. Mrs. Ramsay finds out about Tansley's humble origins. Charles Tansley finds himself thinking about Mrs. Ramsay's sublime beauty, even though she's old enough to be his mother. Meanwhile, Mr. Ramsay decides to take a walk. He runs into William Banks and Lucy Briscoe, who are talking. Unfortunately, Mr. Ramsay makes the situation awkward as he almost knocks over Lily Briscoe's easel. Later, Mrs. Ramsay knits some stockings for the unnamed McAllister's son. Near her is James, who's thinking about plunging scissors into his dad's heart. Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay take a walk in the garden, considering each other's strengths and weaknesses. Lily Briscoe randomly thinks about Mrs. Ramsay. She has been trying to paint the woman with little success. Finally, Mrs. Ramsay holds a dinner party with all of the major characters. This scene is long and the conversation varies. Basically, the characters enhance their personalities. Charles ridicules Lily. Lily contemplates Mrs. Ramsay. Mrs. Ramsay watches her isolated husband, and Mr. Ramsay is isolated at the end of the table, thinking about the end of the world. Paul, Minta, and the others are present as well, but their thoughts are not described. As the end of the book approaches, a short chapter tells of the death of Mrs. Ramsay, as well as the dilapidation of the now abandoned Ramsay house. Lily, Carmichael, Mr. Ramsay, Cam, and James all come back to visit at the same time. Mr. Ramsay, Cam, and James head off to the lighthouse almost a decade after Mrs. Ramsay's death. During the boat ride, James realizes, to his horror, that he's not so much different from his father. Lily watches the boat from afar, finally receiving the inspiration she needs to paint.
Summary 2.
Let's break this down. In the beginning, James asks Mrs. Ramsay if they can go to the lighthouse. Charles Tansley and Mr. Ramsay tell him no, while Mrs. Ramsay remains optimistic. Lily Briscoe, after having a nice conversation with William Banks, decides to sit down and paint, which she really can't do because she's not inspired, but she does contemplate the meaning of life. In the middle, Mrs. Ramsay holds a dinner party, and then she dies. Finally, in the end, James, Cam, and Mr. Ramsay all make it to the lighthouse. Lily paints a picture of beauty. And so the story ends with brief closure and aesthetic masterpiece.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes. That's all it took. 5 minutes.